So, welcome to the final session of Kernel's Open Data Guild that began with Luis Obada in symphony with a wonderful man named Don Nguyen. And I began here not just because of the South African connection, but also because the framing question for this guild, if you remember, is can open data facilitate friendship? We have a long history of the search for a universal book, for a universal library, for a mundaneum, for various kinds of things associated with both access to collective human knowledge and perfect language. And if we were able to develop that, the claim has always been that we could ensure world peace. That was what the mundaneum was about. It's what the search for the universal book has been about. And we're a little bit more humble as a result of some of our own experiences, both in the web and in life in general. We're only asking, does opening the data that we use make it more possible to facilitate friendship between one another? We think that might lead us away from some of the inevitably hubristic contradictions and ironies that happen to places like the Mundaneum, which was, if you remember from our first session, taken over by the Third Reich and turned into a museum to Hitler. So keeping all of that context in mind, I wanted to just remind everybody where we've been in this guild and frame the discussion that will take place today, which is about trans-local contexts. We began with transfinity. We did transact. We thought deeply about what it might mean to transcend by not just having open data, but using it, and what the use of that data might actually do and mean in a shared and public ledger. And now we're back to where we always already are, our local contexts. If you remember, we have been looking at the double directedness of the word data throughout the whole guild. Data is something given, which means it's established as a fact. It is given that I have here a beautiful cup of rooibos because it's a wonderful tea. And if you ever come to South Africa, you will also be inundated with it, I'm sure. But also, not just that which is established as a fact, something given, as in a gift. And we've been looking at how this notion that when we are able to share that which is given with increasingly more people, when we can establish facts that are shared by more people, we can create more value. And this value also has a double directedness, right? Because values are facts in computer science, quite literally. Factum means something that has happened, right? So it's associated with time, and it is a value that we store in some kind of shared media for memory. You have a database, keys and values, and you have a key that gets associated with certain values. And then you don't write over those values in place. You just add new keys that are associated with new values as the world changes. So the fact that Barack Obama was president remains true while it becomes possible to write new keys with new presidents. It doesn't change that fact. It's this notion that we have more shared facts, more value, literally from a computer science perspective, but also from the socio-technological perspective as it applies to our psychology and our sociology. That value is really a function of trust in that which is given, which we've been looking at for 7 weeks now, and hopefully is somewhat familiar for you. I wanted to also set the intention for our conversation today, which is to paint a picture of these pleasing gifts, the agalmias that we've been looking at, as opposed to economies. You will remember that in economies, the whole thing is about supply and demand, and they need to be in dynamic balance. But when we have agalmias, which are the study and allocation of non-scarce goods like knowledge, data, this kind of stuff, then it's not about supply and demand so much as it is about the production and allocation of those non-scarce goods. Having more clever people is not a problem because it creates more knowledge, more opportunity to collaborate. And the more knowledge we have, that doesn't just an increase in the supply of knowledge doesn't mean that like demand goes down, anybody knows that when you answer a question, when you give more knowledge, 1,000 more questions bloom. Right? This is why in the Zen tradition, we don't ask the questions. It's terrible because when you answer a question, more questions, endless. But this is a wonderful thing in agalmic terms. So we're here to paint a picture of these pleasing gifts that open our time together into more valuable collaborations, which are centered on an awareness of the environment and a deep appreciation of local context. You have to look at these tracks and traces, both as they apply in the digital, but also more widely. I don't want to spend a lot of time. I know there's a lot of writing on these. Just to remind you that these are the features of agalmic goods. They're transfinite. So when I give you one, it doesn't decrease the value for which I am responsible. They're cooperative, self-interested, self-stimulating, self-directing, decentralized, positive sum, and they're not new. Right? This is not something new. Agalmia, it's a Greek term, pleasing gift. And I just wanted to remind you of where we were at the end of session 1 in particular, because we came to this point where I was trying to illustrate that this is not just about data science, which is really what we've been looking at in the last 2 sessions, but we're going to come back now in this final session to the notion of data as art. Right? We were saying it's not just about like the knowledge and the repositories that they're in, but a network of different repositories of different kinds of knowledge, the shape of which is capable of contextualizing the knowledge that we ourselves work with in our own local contexts, such that we can have open data that is not just open in a procedural or technical sense, but in an ethical one. Right? What does it mean to be open in an ethical sense? And that it's not really about these knowledge repositories as they come out of the history of computer science, but really community gardens. Right? And in the same sense as we have these features of agalmias, gardens are really interesting because they're responsive, they live and they die, they grow in many different places, never in the same way. They serve many different people in many different ways. They fulfill both aesthetic and utilitarian functions. They grow by virtue of being pruned and cleaned. And they require ecological intelligence and a certain kind of cultivated awareness. So that's really what we're here to talk about in some way, is this artful gardening and gathering. Because when we do that, we can notice that explicit coordination is less important than collective ecological intelligence. And finally, to recall Vannevar Bush's 1945 essay on which all of this stuff is based, which is called As We May Think. We're trying and we need trails laid by courageous and careful people, which we can use to inspire better questions, more fruitful searching, more responsive consultation. That is what can hopefully lead us toward a more open-hearted asking of this core question in the Guild. Can open data facilitate friendship? So I have a few more quotes from Boyd, which I'm going to come back to in a moment. But before I do that, in order to try and ground the local context here, I want to introduce Boyd and Richie. Richie has been a Colonel Fellow before. Boyd is his brother-in-law and a friend, an incredible duo in many ways, and the perfect people to really help illustrate what the power of like global, transparent, and open tools is in local contexts. I don't want to take words out of your mouth, Richie. I would love you, if you're willing, to introduce us to Index Africa, the work that you have been doing in and around the Kruger Park, the application of these high-tech tools to local environments, local communities, education and fundraising within the place that you call home. And if you could tell us a little bit about that place that you call home and how these tools have been applied there, it would be a lovely, lovely place to start our discussion.
Amazing. Yeah. Well, thank you very much for having us, Andy. It's such a pleasure to be here. And, you know, after doing the kernel block like 18 months ago, yeah, it had a really profound impact on the way I looked at Web3. So it's an honor and a privilege to be here today. So I guess the starting point is perhaps just a bit of background about where I come from and where Boyd comes from. But I got to meet him many years ago at university, and then we bumped into each other at a house party in about 2009, and we fought over a beer, and that was the beginning of a great friendship, which would see me coming to Londolozi to do technology. And the location of Londolozi is in 6 million acres of transfrontier wilderness. It's in a very, very beautiful part of South Africa. And I joined his family business, which really focused on conservation, ecotourism, and really developing opportunities for the people who live and work in and around the game reserve. And that was kind of the journey that I began with him on. Fast forwarding into about 2018, 2019, we really started to look at Web3 as a nascent technology. And through a friendship of ours, we got introduced to the Graph network, the Graph protocol, and we got involved and we became indexers, and we set up the first indexing node in Africa, which was something that we were very proud of, because we really wanted to put Africa on the map as proud South Africans and as proud Africans. And I think the context here was that we wanted to look at ways in which we could create our positioning differently, because essentially we're not that technical, we're more storytellers and we're more lateral thinkers. And so what we came up with was an idea where we could raise delegation onto our indexing node and use that to contribute towards a positive sum game. And what I mean by that is that for every 10% of rewards that we earn from our indexing node, we contribute that to our NGO partner, which is the Good Work Foundation. And I'll come back to how the model works, but essentially the Good Work Foundation was something that Boyd started with his old teacher, who, when traveling around Africa with him when he was growing up and doing a lot of work across Africa. And they started in 2005, just building one very small school in a town called Philippolis. And in about 2012, the Good Work Foundation really formalized, and it took an old banana shed and it converted that into a digital learning center in a small town about 80 kilometers of where we're based here at Londolozi. And the idea behind it was that the Good Work Foundation wanted to prove that anyone who is given access, the difference between success and failure in this world is simply a function of access, and providing access to people in an old banana shed living in a rural space. We could plug them into the digital economy, and we could give them education. We could give them job creation and opportunities of that. And in August this year, they celebrated their 10-year anniversary, and it was pretty profound to see a lot of those students who'd come into the Good Work Foundation when they were young, starting to actually graduate, and to see the efforts of the Good Work Foundation having real tangible benefits to the people of this region. So what we had was two things going on. We had a local context where we were operating in. We're from this beautiful part of the world called Mpumalanga, which is the state or the province we live in. We have a focus on conservation. We have a focus on rural education and empowering people. And with our journey into Web3, we now had a technology where we could try and create a very strange Venn diagram that would hopefully stimulate ideation and innovation. And from that came this idea of raising funds for the Good Work Foundation through delegation. And essentially what we did was took a traditional escrow fundraising model and we plugged it into a decentralized finance model. And we coined that term decentralized philanthropy, or for lack of a better word, we called it DeFi, spelled D-E-P-H-I, which was, like a natural play on the sort of the trend of the time in 2020, 2021. And since we began that, delegation started to accrue on the node. The earnings each month would accrue, and we were able to start providing funding to the Good Work Foundation and plugging more and more students into open learning, digital education. And the next step of what we're doing is we're plugging a Web3 Academy into the Good Work Foundation so that these students who are introduced to digital technology can now be introduced to the world of Web3 and can start to find their way and find opportunities for themselves in the space. So that's a bit of background, and it was kind of the starting point of our journey thus far into Web3. But I don't know if you want to add anything onto the story.
I mean, certainly, you know, like many people, I came into the Web3 space through friendship, you know, through someone introducing me to it, talking to me about it, and being a highly non-technical person, but being someone who have an ear for what's important. As I travel extensively through the world, so I'm in lots of different energy fields, and I heard someone say, you know, one of those sentences that when you hear it, you know that's in some ways that's the future. I heard someone say, the network generates value rather than extracts it. And when I heard that, I knew that if that is true, that is incredibly important for triggering a state of abundance in the world. And I had this strange situation where I was between Silicon Valley and South Africa. We were operational on the ground in South Africa in the education space. And here were these networks that could potentially generate value rather than extract it. And the idea of what that could mean for local people in the most rural parts of South Africa, if they could be connected with that network, was just instantly incredibly exciting to me. And so that became the track that I knew we had to follow. And you know, I think our early movements we've been trying to build a model that is an abundance model. A learner from the most rural village can walk into a high-tech previous banana shed, can, out of earnings off of a node, be put into a course that teaches them basic digital literacy and then Web3 literacy. And then in turn, as a result of that, can participate in a future emerging economy. And that idea seemed to be an idea that was centered around abundance to me. The network generating the means by which someone could upskill themselves and in turn build onto expanding the network was just like a beautifully elegant kind of thing to me. And so that has become the space that we've really tried to play and that lights us up.
Incredible. I find what you do so inspiring, and I have a lot of follow-up questions, including some others for Boyd, but I would also love to welcome Eva Beylin, who is with us from the Graph today. And Eva, it's really, first of all, as always, an honor to have you on. And secondly, I wonder if you can help give some wider context to the kind of local interactions you're seeing form across the Graph network, and in general, what you strive for as one of the people in a position of leadership of the Graph as this global foundation. Where are you trying to take kind of local developments and global vision, and how do those come together in your world?
Yeah, first of all, thanks for having me, Andy, and sorry if I look a wreck. I'm a little sick today.
You're never correct, and it's really wonderful to have you, I promise.
Great to see you, Boyd and Richie. Yeah, so I mean, to me, honestly, like networks and building networks have to be local. Like that's really the baseline. You can think about building networks in this very top level, sort of hierarchical way that doesn't touch the people on the ground, but that doesn't actually achieve what you want, which is like direct impact, change in people's lives. In the case of crypto, it's like direct income, right? That's a lot of what we talk about with proof of stake or participation in protocols, is like people being able to earn directly for their services. So a lot of what we focus on at the Graph is how do we get involved in every single community very directly and grow from there? Because the power of word of mouth, and kind of like Boyd said, like it starts with a friendship. I got in crypto from my brother, who, like, you know, many people might have gotten into crypto from my brother. Who did I get into crypto? Who did they get into crypto? And so that ends up being hundreds, maybe thousands of people at the end of the day. So for example, we have something called Graph Advocates DAO, which is a DAO focused on community events, translations, kind of building the ecosystem out. And they put on events. So whether it's for the Graph birthday or, you know, local meetups, they start creating events themselves. They receive grants for those. You know, that itself is like business development for the Graph, but also they're able to grow their own network for their own businesses. So whether they're an indexer or maybe they have something else they're doing on the Graph that grows their ability to grow their kind of capability.
the interplay of the two is something that I'm really kind of fascinated by, because it, in the scene setting here, right? Like Vannevar Bush is sort of mentioned, and he has this vision in 45 of what he calls the mimics. And one of the things that is so fascinating about the mimics is that he says you have you need some requirement for the top-down classification of knowledge according to library science and the various state-of-the-art tools that have been developed for helping people navigate large bodies of data. But then you have the bottom-up social uses of the information. This is where he talks about these user trails, right? These courageous trailblazers, which I'm going to bug Boyd about in a while. But these courageous trailblazers through the collective record, and it's like our trails that we can share with one another. And Eva, so I'm really interested in that notion of like top-down classification according to like the state-of-the-art tools, and then like the emergent social uses of the knowledge, and then they like meet and contextualize one another. And so like I deeply appreciate what you said about like the need for local networks, but I wonder if you can say a bit more about like how those interface with not just like the advocacy DAO, but like global strategy and local. I'm thinking cosmo-localism as it applies from the cosmos, but like where do those narratives meet? Because that's the thread, right? Like it's one narrative that's like applied broadly in different contexts, and the way that story unfolds and then flows back up is so fascinating. And I wonder,
narrative is an interesting word, because I would say the narrative that we're trying to drive, and not only the graph, but Ethereum and others, is resilience. And like we can say, okay, we want to be global for the sake of being global, but in crypto, you have to be global because that's actually survival. Like you are building a system that is attack resistant, right? That like one jurisdiction can't take down or shouldn't take down. So to me, like where it comes together is, okay, people need to be around the world to create the system that is resilient. We literally cannot have the majority of the system be in one country or in one data center or using one client or whatever that means. And so the passion that we see on the ground is like, these people recognize that like their contributions where they are physically matters, like where they are in their culture, the way that they maybe operate, like even having diversity in pricing models or parameters is important for the health of a blockchain or a system, because that implies that if something goes bad, there's always at least one operator or one participant or whatever that can kind of keep it going. So when we think about like the advocates, or even like we have like an indexing program right now that I believe Graphica might be part of right now. We really strive for that to be globally decentralized, because for the sake of the protocol and sort of like our collective positive sum survival, it's really important for people on the ground in different areas to really know what's going on and be participating.
Beautiful. That's a lovely answer. Thank you so much. It really helps me see a lot, and that point about resilience is a fascinating one. Richie, I want to throw it back to you here, because I know that part of the way that the GoodWorks Foundation is funded, and your work in the sort of DeFi space in general, the real DeFi, we might call it, is indeed through Londolosian and through the lens of resilience. One of the questions that comes up for me is that the technology is still fairly nascent. First of all, like, is it possible to fund an educational program fully off of the delegated rewards you receive from running an indexer? How has that been for you? And on a practical level, how is the DeFi stuff working out from a resilience perspective, before we get into some of the wider ranging, more abstract topics?
So that's a really good question, because the reality is that we were funding a significant portion of the educational component that we do fund. Once, look, it's a factor of token price converted into fiat currency, so that's definitely a factor in terms of how much that we can contribute. In terms of what we have staked in respect to how much delegation we have in respect to the rewards that we earn every 28-day epoch, it funds a portion of the annual budget of the GoodWorks Foundation, but it doesn't nearly fund all that's required in terms of the millions of dollars that go into funding the educational setup that we've got. But what we've worked on is a proof of concept with the Index Africa project. The next iteration of what we're doing is to really look for financial backing, like a crypto hedge fund partner who we can say, give us $100 million and buy GRT token that you will own, and just lend it to us that we can stake it and we can run an indexer operation purely for the said cause, for the NGO, for the Good Work Foundation. And all of those rewards as a byproduct of that $100 million worth of GRT will go towards funding it. And in that respect, the economics will absolutely work. It's just finding the right partners who are willing to take the risk for themselves in terms of token ownership, and who are willing to lend it to us in the interests of a philanthropic endeavor.
Incredible. Yeah, I love that. We have many things to talk about also in terms of free learn and perpetual scholarships. The notion of having that 100 million exist in a protocol as opposed to some particular person's bank account enables like the perpetual use of those funds as opposed to their single uses is often the case, which is really interesting and exciting from educational models. But I want to shift gears a little bit here, Boyd, because one of the really big hopes and intentions of Kernel is not just to talk about the how, like how do we program open data systems and how do we make sure that the money flows to the right places. All of these things are really important to what we do, but we also focus on why does it matter? Why do we care about open data? Why do we care about these like very abstruse, nerdy, technical things? Why aren't we all living with you in the bush, just kind of, running around from Southern Cross Copy to a particular and beautiful rock on the river, which is actually where I want to take you. As you can see on the screen here, there are some wonderful quotes from Boyd, who his most recent book is called The Lion Tracker's Guide to Life. I highly recommend it. And over again, there's this thread which comes up of, I'm following the trail of my own life and reporting back the tracks and traces that we find across the earth, quite literally allow us to understand our relationship with the environment. They are read within ourselves by a certain process of attunement, which is taught and transferred across the generations. The lessons that one learns from tracking across the Great Sand Face, which is what it was once called here in South Africa in particular, are not different to the lessons that we can learn from tracing our own tracks across the Great Digital Face. And one of the places I want to begin, Boyd, is Plaque Rock, because here is a plaque with your ancestral name on it in Londolozi. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about this particular track in your life and how it, or what role it has played in like imbuing meaning in who you are and how you navigate the world, because understanding these tracks and these traces and that process of attunement it's not just a tracker's work. It seems to have so much to do with so many of us, so many of our particular work in the world. And I'd love to hear what that sparks in you and what it calls out for.
I mean, a few things. One is that it's a place, this beautiful granite dome that falls down towards the river. And it's a place that was where my grandfather would go for solace and for silence and to contemplate. And so when he passed away, his ashes were scattered there. And immediately the place stops being just an inanimate place and it starts to be a place with meaning, because it has a very unique story attached to it. And so then it became a place where my father would go for the same reason. And then as a result of that, a place that I go when I am feeling lost and a bit discombobulated. And as a result of that, the actual physical plenum starts to hold structures of meaning within it. And usually those structures of meaning have to do with a sense of place. And built into a sense of place is usually a sense of belonging. And, you know, this place somehow has something to do with who I am. And being here and being in the presence of this space helps me know myself in some very intangible way. It helps me understand where I come from. It helps me understand where I'm going. And it infuses my life almost effortlessly with a meaning and a connectivity and a relationality that is the fabric of a deeper relationship with life itself. And the funny thing is that you know, we talk a lot about everyone is looking for their purpose, everyone is looking for more meaning. And if you have a sense of place, if you have a relationship with a place, and I mean relational, and by that I mean the place is helping you know who you are, and strangely your presence there is helping the place be what it is. If you have that, it's what starts to happen is naturally a feeling of connectivity started to arise. I am connected to this place is connected to me. There is something happening here that I'm a part of. And when you have that experience of a sort of an expanding relationship with a place or oneness, you don't have to work that hard to constellate meaning. It simply arises naturally. And that's why it's kind of a satori experience, as they would call it in Japan, a feeling of oneness. Within that experience, the meaning is innate. You don't have to work for it. It is simply there. Everything is meaningful, alive, connected, living. And, you know, when I go to that place, you know, sometimes I think I'll go there to know nature, to go and just be present with it. But the real deeper sensation is the feeling of being known by everything around me. And I think somehow, as we evolve how we interact with each other and we evolve the categories and spaces in which we can be connected, I think that the very basic human structures of relationality will start to flow into those spaces and create different anchor points of belonging. Just like we have in the physical world, I think that will start to translate into somehow being known and knowing yourself through the different places where we feel we have community throughout a more digital arena.
Thank you so much for that. The diffusion of this sense of place is a fascinating one for me, and it's a mark of so much of the podcast that you and Richie have put together, which is why I pick a particular place at Londolozi to ground the discussion. But even the process of bringing that podcast, first with the 40 Nights and now with Sacred Sites in the next season, you know, like, it's so fascinating to me because you're out there alone in the wild world, truly, and then you record it and put it onto an MP3, and there's a tree drop, and there's this intricate movement of energy through the physical world, which then enables the rendering or representation of that place in this like shared network. And somehow the unseen, it remains as such, but it has something of something of the collective attention shapes it. And I'm fascinated by that, and I'm fascinated by that process.
I mean, me too. An artist friend of mine, when I was living alone in the tree, the irony of it is I went to be in solitude. I went to be alone. And during those 40 days and 40 nights, I spoke to more people every day than any time in my normal life. The podcast was getting thousands of daily downloads. And so in this very strange way, I was sharing to crowds, way bigger than you could imagine, in total solitude. And yet somehow the experience was, I was having experiences that I was then interpreting through a frame of narrative and meaning making. And then those were traveling through digital sort of cyberspace as mouth noises that would go into people's ears and then be interpreted inside of their own meaning structures. And so it was going from very high touch, the natural world, into very high tech, back into a very high touch personal space. And people, people weren't listening to my story, they were creating their own story inside of my story of being connected, being on a journey, transforming, healing. So what that could mean for us is remarkable. I don't think I can even fully grasp the scope of what that could mean for a collective meaning making. I can't even begin to really hold the scope of what that could be. And that's the thing to me about the Web3 space is that we don't yet fully know the scope of connection, innovation, relationship, transformation that can begin to flow out of this. Like, I don't think we can really even conceive of it fully yet. We have ideas about it, but when you start to put these things together, things start to happen that are just beyond what you could imagine. And I think that's what's so excited about it.
Yeah. The famous verse from Corinthians comes up for me, right? Now you know in parts, then you shall know fully. Now here, see as through a glass darkly, then you shall see fully, even as you are seen. Richie, I want to just pass it over to you for a moment here, because you're the one who built the site that hosts this podcast, that is sort of propagating some of Boyd's experiences of solitude in a crowd into the world. And, it strikes me as really interesting that there is this very particular rock in Londolozi that has Boyd's grandfather's and Boyd's name as a plaque on it. It reminds me, my very best friend at school was a Greek man who comes from an island in Greece called Kefalonia, where his family has been for hundreds and hundreds of years. He got married on this island at the family church. It was a tiny, tiny little building, fits 20 people at most. It's a raucous Greek wedding with a Orthodox, Greek priest and people throwing rice at each other. It's really wonderful stuff. But in the graveyard around it, in Greek tradition, you take your grandfather's name, and then your father obviously has your great-grandfather's name, and so on. And so you walk through this graveyard and you see his name on the gravestones time and time and time again. It's really it's a remarkable place, because there's 10 generations of him there. And the rock has that feeling for me when I hear Boyd talk about it, and I hear him talk about this meaningful plenum. But you're also the one who then has translated it into this digital network. And it reminds me of some of the work that we do and think about at Kernel is about building for beauty, right? So like building in a way which acknowledges and is aware of the life in whatever it is that you're doing, and then amplifies it, whether it's a chair or a carpet or a painting or a piece of code. And I wonder, how has it felt to build some of these tools with Boyd? Is the feeling different from what you had done prior in more corporate work? And can you talk a little bit about what that is?
Yeah, absolutely. Andy, I love what you said earlier. It's not like we're doing data science, we're doing data art. And essentially at the essence of Boyd and Mai's professional relationship is a deep desire to bring art and to bring beauty into the world. And a lot of how I look at things is to really get into the detail of something, and to really take the viewpoint that everything matters. And there's this beautiful Simon Sinek construct: why, how, what. And when we were doing this podcast, we had a very distinct why we were doing it, which Boyd has alluded to, and we had a very clear what in terms of that MP3 file format, with the voice that had been recorded onto it that I would collect from the tree every day. But what really mattered was the how we were packaging it, the how we were distributing it, and the feeling that people were able to get with what we were putting out there. And to me, it's like when you think of music. Growing up, I used to go to the CD store in the 90s, showing my age here, but the CD cover was so important because it would tell you intrinsically what the music was about and what the essence of it was about without even having to listen to the CD. And it was the same thing with the packaging of this. You had a music, you had a piece of art that we were putting onto the internet, but the scaffolding around that and the layering around that and the way that we were shaping it with what I call the sort of like illustrative experience was super important to make sure that it conveyed the essence of what we were saying, but also the mystery to allow for people to make their own meaning within it. So that was kind of like the thinking behind the creation of the art and the layering of it.
I mean, one other thing that I would say is that it is an incredible thing for you to be alone in a tree, but in people's ears all over the world, and then for messages to start to come in from Italy, from America, from Canada, from Australia, from Iceland, of people who have taken the time to write an extensive letter about what your journey has meant to them in their own healing and transformation. And a storyteller is a meaning maker. A storyteller helps us, it helps us think about how we should be thinking about things. That's what storytelling is. And it's incredible to me that, the sound file can travel out there and have that kind of an impact in people that you don't know, and who have never met you, and yet somehow your voice has found its way into their ears in a way that has been transformative enough that they have sat down and felt like they need to reach out. And that is, I mean, in terms of what Rich has done is he's built a digital campfire that people feel like they can come and sit around. And to me, that has been just incredible. And as an artist to say, like, I'm gonna fire this arrow of the story I tracked down today out in nature. And then that's my work done. And then somewhere out there, someone else is going to do the other 50% of what's important with this. And they're going to take the story and they're going to make their own meaning with it. So it continues. And the medium through which that is happening is this incredible ability to be connected across time and space in ways that we couldn't have imagined 100 years ago.
But I think that like that medium is such an interesting thing, because it really is around I've lost my train of thought. I had a great insight while you're talking. And it's gone.
That's all right. It'll come back.
It'll come back. Okay, circle back around, Andy.
I will. It's I'm sure a perennial problem around Void. The one piece that I really want to pick up here is the notion of the inconceivable. Like it's not possible for us to grok fully what's a like worldwide web of light is, let alone one that allows for the transfer of valuable gifts without dependence on an intermediary. And those valuable gifts are nothing other than stories which aren't just there to be told and to be listened to, but to be made by the storyteller and then made anew in each listener's experience. That to me is something really, really wonderful. I want to give one example of this for everybody so that it's not just some guys from South Africa sort of waxing lyrical about it, but you can actually go and see one of these in action. Richie, when he talks about the works of art that he is involved in, here is one. It's truly remarkable. It's probably one of the best NFT projects I've seen, and it has to do with the leopards from Londolozi. Each of these represents one of the animals on the property and comes not just with an entire timeline of their sightings, but their entire genealogy, the lines from which they come, and this high detail. I mean, it's really incredible. Look at that, just unbelievable 3D rendering of the coins themselves. It's really if you're looking for like how to do NFTs in an artistic way, which enable the sort of ineffable to sit somewhere there, this is such a good project to explicate that. Because, boy, you know, like the thing that I want to reflect there is that in these transformational places, whether it is collective ritual space, whether it is flow networks, or whether it's just within one's own personal experience, there's always something inconceivable. And that's what's humbling, right? Like that's the critical ingredients in some way. And I wonder if you have any further thoughts on how important it is that the unimaginable stays unimaginable while still being somehow in our awareness.
Oh, I mean, it's such deep terrain. You know, to me, there's a component of remembering and forgetting to it. And somehow it seems that the inconceivable is the mystery itself. And we have moments where we remember and then we forget. And that constant remembering and forgetting is how we create and then lose the track and then have a glimpse of some kind of inspiration and get back onto it. And so there's this, and that is the dance that we're continuously in. But it, you know, and there's a lot that goes with that. One is like the sort of the paradox of searching is that if you knew what you were searching for, you wouldn't be searching. And yet, somehow, if you give yourself to searching, in a strange way, you start to find what you're looking for, but you didn't know you were looking for it. And so there are all of these strange, and that's why it all comes down to relationality and this web of relationality. It's a constant discovery in relationship to each other, in relationship to nature, in relationship to art, in relationship to God, in relationship to it has to happen inside of that relational dynamic, including our relationship with ourselves. So I'm not sure that we're in deep terrain here, and it's probably a little bit over my pay grade, but I know that somehow these things are fundamental to what it means to be a person. And as the world is changing, the ways in which those fundamentals of being human and forgetting how to be human, and they are finding new mediums of expression all the time. But people will, even as we get further away from being face to face with each other, people will find ways to create narratives of belonging, connectivity, community, and relational dynamic. And I think that is the ride we're on in some ways.
So Andy, just to sort of build on what Boyd was saying, and it triggered my thought from a few moments ago. I think a lot of what is inspiring us around the art that we do and the work that we do is to find ways to make people feel, and to allow people to generate a feeling state inside themselves, whether it's through listening to a podcast that allows them to make meaning that makes them feel more whole, or whether it's creating an NFT project around a leopard that makes people feel more connected to a wild animal that still exists in a wilderness area of Southern Africa, in an otherwise urbanized world that's gone crazy. And it's that feeling state that is so important to awaken in people, that draws them to the track of their own life and allows them to find the things that are intuitively guiding them and the things that are pulling them towards what they need to be doing from the highest sense of truth.
I'm so happy you found that thought. Thank you, Richie. It's beautiful. Beautiful. It's really, truly. I think the place. Please, Boyd. Yeah.
I just feel one question for you. Is it's not a question, but I would love your comment on it. I think a lot about new systems for living, and literally, how do we create a different way of living? And like when you start seeing things like, nomad visas emerging in the world, because people can go to Costa Rica, can go somewhere and they can work from wherever they are. And when you go to Austin, Texas at the moment, and I don't think I know one friend who goes to the office on my entire circle. And I feel like, these networks are creating different ways of living. And that's exciting too, because you can shape what the network does, but then the network starts to shape how people live. And I think that I would love to hear your thoughts on what that could mean to how we live, like physically live our lives.
Yeah, that's wonderful. It's true, I think, when we look around us as a result of various different factors, both good and bad. And, in my academic work, there was this really incredible lady, her name is Anne-Marie Willis, and she makes the point prior to Marshall McLuhan and the famous kind of media theorists that the tools we use shape the world, and then the world acts back and shapes us. We're in constant dialogue with our tools and our environments, not just our tools, not just our environment, but both in this double-directed way. And the recognition of that allows for then like what McLuhan is really talking about, which at its best is like this notion of retrieval or recurrence, right? Like what do the media environments within which we exist and by virtue of which we communicate retrieve or reclaim or cause to recur in experience? And one of the reasons that I was so excited about having you on here and bridging these deep time experiences alone in a tree or sleeping on the ground on the Southern Star Koppies or these kinds of places is because I think that one of the core features of these networks is that they inculcate a different experience of time. Right? That finally, like if you read the Bitcoin white paper, it's about these network of timestamp servers. That's literally what Satoshi calls it. Right? Before, everybody was on about miners and trying to find these easy metaphors for things that are close to our own experience. Like the actual wording that was used in that paper is timestamp servers. And it is a means of acting against the authoritarian and impositional dogmatic routine of the clock. With each media environment, Douglas Rushkoff makes this point, and we've had him here as well to sort of make the point that with the development of writing, you get like wonderful collective memory, you get contracts, you also get Moshiach, you get Messiah, right? Because you get covenant with God. Right. And then like the clock comes as a media environment and you get money is time and efficiency and all of these things. And you're put on the 9 to 5 schedule of somebody else's routine, and a peer-to-peer network in which we establish by virtue of doing work or having value at risk, the order of transactions in time is a radically different construct. It's not like better or worse, it's just different. And so like what is open to us at the moment, it seems, is the ability to like imbue a different sense of time in the tools and the environments in which we act. And that's like what time gets enacted is still an open question, right? Because it could be this really rushed hustle bustle, make a quick buck on 24/7, aren't you watching the market, that kind of thing, right? Which is even more manic and hyper financialized than what we currently have. Or it can be like, here's the genealogy of this leopard, and if you come to Londolozi, maybe they'll visit you at night, and there's the story, and there's the sense of deep time and the sense of participation in something greater than oneself, which doesn't cause anxiety or grasping, but something about giving, something about participating, something about like these pleasing open gifts, right?
Sort of triggering a state of abundance. In a world where time is money, you could always be doing more. So productivity becomes paramount, and no one can ever rest. Inside of that psychological construction of time and how much you have of it, and the anecdote to that is an incredible feeling of enough, which has abundance underneath it. And that's where the network generating value rather than extracting it becomes extremely interesting, because it starts to trigger a state of abundance that causes our relationship to what time means to change, and that feeling of enoughness has, in terms of how we live, it has deep knock-ons into the idea that if I feel I have enough, it changes my whole relationship with consumption and a kind of endless need to do things to feel I'm okay. I've coached hundreds of people now, and what you find is that built into the very structure of a consumerist society is the feeling of I'm not doing enough and I'm not good enough. And a strange sense that they seem to have it worked out, but I don't. But if you go and talk to them, they would say, yeah, they seem to have it worked out, but I don't. It's a constant state of there's something I should know, but I don't know what it is. Other people appear to know, but I can't ask them because I must, make the show that I do know. It's this strange sense of like an underlying profound scarcity that then drives everyone to try and get ahead, be okay, and then that drives consumption too. I need these things to fill that emptiness. Whereas if you start to drop into a state of abundance, a state of enoughness, the whole nature of things change, and now it becomes more about how do I share my gifts? How do I create more abundance? It's just a different place to live from.
It reminds me of what Andy said to me very early on when we first started talking, and I was like, Web3, it's going to redistribute wealth. And you said, like, Richie, it's actually about redefining what wealth is. And I thought that was like just a beautifully profound point, because there are people here who don't have a lot of material possessions, but they are rich in spirit. They are rich in the air that they breathe that is so clean. They are rich in family and kinship. And that is really what we and Boyd is talking about in terms of redefining the benchmarks of success in life. And Web3 just offers all of the practical applications of taking these redefinitions and putting them into something tangible through the networks.
Yeah, that's beautiful. That's beautiful. Thank you. Thank you both. Really incredible reflections. This is what I warned you about at the beginning, is that, as soon as you start answering questions, then thousands more come. So before I get caught by my own trap, which is a perennial problem, I wonder, there are a few questions in the chat. Perhaps, Fultus, if you would like, would you be keen to unmute and ask anything at this point before we bring our session to a close? Salim, anybody else who's been commenting in chats, if you would like. Now is the time. Beautiful, beautiful to enjoy a moment of silence to the final point it brings me to is the relationship of all of this, the notion of redefining wealth, the notion of time, the notion of gift giving, and scarcity and abundance is all deeply related to this core Southern African and African philosophy called Ubuntu, right? Umuntu gumuntu gabantu in Zulu. And it's fascinating to me because in the way that we talk about it in Kernel is that there's always the sense of complementary opposites, right? You have time and timelessness. You have self and no self, light and darkness, up and down, always together, right? It's such a critical thing. You can't say there's no self because who's saying it? But at the same time, you can't validate the self from perspective of small ego. You can't say, oh, only timeless, because language is it's always already bound to time, right? Like our words propagate by virtue of sound, which is a longitudinal wave in space, which is bound to time. Time and timeless go together irretrievably. So, and in the way that we look at things in Kernel, we say that scarcity is complemented by reciprocity. There are things in this world that are scarce. And recognizing that is not the grounds for fear, uncertainty, or anxiety. It is a call to generosity, right? Because I know generosity, the highest level of generosity is when I give what I need, right? Not when I give before it is asked or more than it is asked or what is asked. When I give what I need, there's a uniquely human action. God cannot do it because there's no need in God, whatever you imagine that to be, right? Beyond need or satiation. But humans have needs. So to give what one needs, what one cannot get more of, is the roots of generosity. Scarcity and reciprocity go together, just as abundance seems to be complemented by sacrifice. That there's something really deep about that particular notion, abundance and sacrifice. You see this in all of the great texts around the world, probably most explicitly in the Quran, where the shortest chapter, it's called Surat al-Kawthar. It's 3 lines, 3 lines long. Kawthar is the font of heavenly abundance. So it's the chapter about abundance, shortest in the whole book. and it begins, surely within you is a font of heavenly abundance. So pray to your Lord and Sustainer and make a sacrifice. Surely your enemy is he who is without posterity. The enemy in this sense is a genuine historical figure, but also little self, right? The one that does not survive this life. None of us do. So I wonder if that triggers any kind of last comments around the notion of what being in relationship, what being a human through other humans, and the call to reciprocity and sacrifice that brings, which then, by virtue of that, breeds like abundance and generosity, which is never ours, but comes about through that kind of really honest, like looking at the ways in which we participate in the world, the kind of gifts that we receive and give.
Sure, it's deep. It's a deep question. I mean, one thing that comes to mind, and I don't know if this is sort of adjacent, but in a society where the individual self is connected from the greater whole, the search for meaning is reduced to a constant state of comparison. And we see that in kind of the classical, states of modern life, the car, the house, the who's the top of the food chain. It's trying to orientate who I am and how am I doing against in constantly comparative. And that is actually, it's structured into the very fabric of a consumeristic society. So it's not so much that you are comparing, it's that you can't help not, because it's there all the time inside of the ideals. And the remedy to that is to move out of comparison into relation, and to somehow know that, one, our well-being is tied together, and two, the gift is that everything in relation has the opportunity to take you to places that you couldn't get to in yourself. Anyone who's ever fallen in love knows this, right? It's like, this particular feeling comes through this relation. And so I certainly think that is worth pursuing, because how much is in there that we don't know how to get to until we open to a more relational way of living. And there's a curiosity to that. There's an excitement to that. There's an abundance to living like that. If comparison is usually scarce, then relation is usually, even when it's painful, somehow abundant. And I'm not sure that answers the question at all, but it pinged for me.
Yeah, it's beautiful. The relation, even when it's painful, is abundant. I can't live with her. I can't live without her.
Oh,
what are we to do? Wonderful. Truly, that's remarkable. Thank you so very, very much, both of you, Richie and Boyd. I know Eva has already had to go to another call in her global strategy, but I really, really appreciate you taking the time out of a beautiful day, in the Eastern wilds and coming to have a chat with all of us.
Thank you for
Kernel.
having us. It's great to be with you, and so
Thank you, Andy.
interesting and so beautiful, the work, and thanks for letting us be a part of it.